Welcome to Life Cycle Talks, a series of talks presenting the research front to keep you up to date with the science and application of the life cycle perspective. Today's life cycle talk is why do we need a life cycle perspective on negative emissions? And we will increase our knowledge and understanding of the role of negative emissions in climate change mitigation and the methods for achieving negative emissions. My name is Anna Wikström, and I'm happy to welcome our guest for today, Cecilia Sundberg, Associate Professor in Bioenergy Systems at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, SLU. Warm welcome, Cecilia. And before we start, I just want to inform you about some practical information. All the Life Cycle Talks will be published and available on the Swedish Life Cycle Center YouTube channel, and the raise hand function will not be used in Life Cycle Talks, but you can ask questions in the Q&A here in Zoom. And we will pick up questions from there to the question part later on after Cecilia's presentation. Back to you, Cecilia, and welcome. I'm curious, what prompted you start studying this research field?
Oh, thank you. Yes, I've always been interested in technologies and systems to reduce the climate impacts. And other methods to not just reduce impact to zero, but even below zero to negative side. That's, of course, very intriguing and interesting.
Great, thank you so much. And now, please, it's time for your life cycle talk.
Thank you. So, this figure is from the most recent report of the IPCC. That told us that have severe climate impacts ahead of us, and to reduce that severity, we really need to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions fast. And as we can see from these curves, from carbon dioxide needs to be reduced to zero, and even towards the end of this century below zero, as per the modeled pathways that can keep global warming below 2 degrees. And this means that we need to have some negative terms, some methods of actually removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So for climate change mitigation, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also remove carbon dioxide. So how can this be done? And why do we need a life cycle perspective here? There are various technologies. There's not a lot of different methods, but there's quite some variety within them. And to the left here, we see trees, we see soil, so storing carbon in trees and soils. We also have biochar, a method of using biomass to store carbon. Another way to go from biomass to storing carbon is through bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, where CO2 is captured and placed in safe storage in geological formations. And all of these technologies I will come back to. So I will just briefly mention the other technologies here to the right. We have enhanced weathering. That's minerals that react with carbon dioxide to form other minerals that are stable. And by exposing these to more CO2, this can be accelerated. There's also direct air capture of carbon dioxide and storage of this in geological storage. This can be done perfectly well to take the carbon dioxide that is very diluted in the atmosphere and concentrate that. That costs a lot of energy, but is another option. And finally, here to the right, we have the oceans. They take up carbon dioxide through natural processes, and these can be influenced and affected through ocean fertilization and alkalinization. That, of course, has impact on the ocean ecosystems, but it's also an option that is being researched. So to understand these different processes, there is demand for information from life cycle assessments. There's an interest in understanding how large is the climate impact of different carbon dioxide removal technologies, and how large are other environmental impacts. And for that, life cycle assessments can give some answers. This is of interest for product development, for designing production systems that are efficient and have low impacts. It's also of interest for organizations who want to reach their net zero targets, to include negative emission methods in their greenhouse gas accounting. This is of interest for carbon markets, especially in the voluntary carbon market seems to be an important venue for investments in negative emissions. And there, the possibility to use this as carbon offsets is of interest. And of course, you want to have a good value on the actual climate impacts for that. And then there's also a need for policy development in this area, and to develop good policy. Of course, this kind of information is also demanded. So we have one excellent method for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and that's the photosynthesis. Plants use solar energy to take up carbon dioxide and build organic carbon molecules. And this can be stored in the plants, in the trees, also transported into soils and in rather stable molecules there. Some of this remains in products, but this is also a balance, because this carbon dioxide is released again through respiration, through combustion. So it's a temporary carbon storage, but still we have so much trees, forests and soils on the planet, so this does have an impact and it's meaningful on the planetary scale. But we're also interested in this from a production system perspective. And there I will just show one example of growing energy forests on agricultural land. So willow is a dedicated energy crop, and it's harvested in short cycles. And as we see on the left here, when we start growing this on agricultural land, there will be a buildup of carbon in the biomass and in the roots and in the soil. And this together will give negative emissions. There's a bit of up and down here due to the harvesting and regrowth, but the overall trend is negative. And in the figure to the right, we see how this is for producing a certain amount of heat from these willows in comparison, which is at the bottom line below zero, and comparing this to the worst that we have, the worst of the fossil fuels using coal, which is the black line. And we see then that the main benefit here is by shifting from fossil fuels to the bioenergy. But there's also this negative component adding a little bit extra in this bioenergy system. But if we would then return this to annual crop agriculture, producing food again, these buildup of soil carbon would gradually be lost. So this is just a temporary storage, but other ways to have more permanent storage also of biogenic carbon. And yes, we do have one option, which is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So in normal bioenergy systems as we use them today, this carbon dioxide that has been taken up by plants is released again when we combust to get that energy out of the biomass. But if we capture that carbon dioxide and transport it into safe storage, there's the option of actually creating a negative emission technology. And to know whether this is worthwhile, we need, of course, to investigate this carbon capture technology, how much energy is used there and other emissions, the transport, and the actual storage, to make sure that that this is efficient enough, this production system producing carbon dioxide removal as a service. And in this case, it seems actually that using carbon dioxide removal as a functional unit is meaningful. That might be counterintuitive when you come from life cycle assessment and you see carbon dioxide emissions and also the negative emissions as a climate impact. But with the carbon markets, this is a product as well. And using that functional unit is an additional functional unit to consider, in addition to these energy products that we are used to and biomass. And then to my final example, this is the technology that I've been working mostly with, biochar. That is biomass that has been heated without combusting it, so that we get solid carbon that microorganisms can't have difficulties in degrading, which means that this will stay much longer in the environment than the raw biomass that it was produced from. And if we're interested in knowing the climate footprint of such a supply chain for biochar, we need to investigate the biomass supply, environmental impacts there. We need to look at the processing, pyrolysis process that produces this biochar. And of course, the amounts of biochar and the quality of that biochar, but also the co-products, because this pyrolysis process also produces combustible liquids and gases. In the most simple case, they can be burnt and heat produced, but also other products are possible. And with that, we can get life cycle climate footprint of the supply chain. And for some purposes that is of interest. But if our interest is in what the net climate impact of deploying a whole biochar system is, then we need to expand this even further to consider, yes, the biomass, but also the uses of the biochar. And this is from an example from the Stockholm Biochar project, one of the earliest applied biochar projects, where garden wastes from parks and gardens are transformed into biochar, and then the energy is used for district heating, and the biochar is used as a planting substrate for trees in the city. And eventually, in decades ahead, that soil substrate can end up in landfills. And here we have several functions then in such a system. This garden waste is treated, and to understand the climate impact, here we need to compare to how that garden waste would otherwise have been treated. We produce district heat and need to compare that to alternative production of district heating. There's tree planting, and in that tree planting also the rainwater from the city is managed, and we need to compare that with how that would otherwise have been done. So here we have 4 functions, and we haven't even here specified the carbon dioxide removal as a function, but that is indeed, as described earlier, a function of this kind of system. With that, I've given a brief overview of some negative emission technologies and how they can be investigated with a life cycle perspective. So in conclusion, we do need negative emissions in order to reach climate targets. And these technologies that remove carbon dioxide need to be assessed in a life cycle perspective in order to identify the best options in a given context. And this means that we need to consider the multifunctionality, which provides potential synergies. So there are negative emission technologies that can give us other benefits, both in terms of products, but also in terms of additional climate change mitigation, other environmental impacts. And of course, also there are always risks of trade-offs with other environmental impacts. So with that, I'd like to thank you for listening to my life cycle talk.
Thank you, Cecilia, for your presentation. Great. And now I have some questions for you. And to the audience, you're welcome to use the Q&A function in Zoom if you have any questions to Cecilia. My first question, Cecilia, is your research within negative emissions. Why is it important, and for whom is it important?
Yes, if we are to get good negative emissions, we need to have producers who do this and know what is the good technology. We need policy to guide this. We need investors to know where to place their money. So there's quite a few actors here that I think need this kind of information.
Great, thank you. And you gave a few examples of techniques for carbon dioxide removal. Which of these are the most promising, has the biggest positive impact?
I don't want to give an answer to that at the general level, because I think it's so important how we deploy any of these methods. It's really about doing each one in a good way and in the right place at the right time. It's
Great.
not going to be one silver bullet.
Great. Can you develop the need for dynamic LCA metrics? How can that be achieved, and or what is needed to achieve that?
Yes, so for all these negative emissions that don't store carbon dioxide for thousands of years, but shorter, we need to understand how the dynamics are, for how long is it stored, and that then means that we need to look at not just at one point in time, but to look at the time series and evaluate that. So in order to be able to do that, it's perfectly possible to do that in life cycle assessment, but that means that you have to have annual life cycle inventory and place this, then use that inventory data into dynamic impact assessment method.
Okay, thank you. And if biochar has so many benefits, then why is it not used in large scale? Is there any limitations?
I think the main limitation is that it takes time for technologies to find their place and to grow, and this is something that is rather new. It's growing fast, but from very low level. The first markets are developing, and we'll see how large it becomes, but there's definitely a large growth potential, that's for sure.
Great. And we have a connected question about that. What is the potential of biochar in Europe, and how seasonal conditions impact its usefulness for negative emissions?
So potentials to me is very much a political instrument, and it's hard as a scientist to say something definitive about potential because it depends on so many factors. What is clear is that it has the potential to be meaningful on a continental climate scale. Doesn't mean that it will solve our problems, but it will be there's a potential to have it at a size that is meaningful from a climate perspective. There was a second question there.
How seasonal conditions impact its usefulness for negative emissions, and how seasonal conditions impact its usefulness for negative emissions.
Yeah, so seasonality, that would depend very much on the use. So I'm not sure that I have anything to say about that at a general level.
Okay. And another question is, what applications of biochar will give the highest benefit according to today's knowledge?
So, it's first in the production process to make sure that we don't waste energy, but take the energy byproducts and use them in a good way in our energy system. Then to look for additional climate benefits. And these we can find if biochar can replace some other material that has a large climate impact. Peat is, for example, a soil substrate that has a large climate impact that we want to replace. There are also construction materials, other materials. And then also if the biochar can impact the emissions from soil, nitrous oxide from agriculture is the last source of greenhouse gas emissions. And if we apply biochar in a way so that we reduce nitrous oxide emissions, then we also have a great potential.
Great, thank you. And are there specific considerations in terms of the LCA assessment per se? Meaning, for example, how the analysis methodology needs to be adapted for such negative emission technologies?
Yes, there's not just one way of doing LCAs for negative emissions. It has to depend on the specific purpose of the analysis. But one thing that appears to me to require a bit different way of thinking than many of us are used are these carbon credits that are traded, and how to do life cycle assessment in the right way for that application. And that, of course, has large economic impacts also. So there's really a need to get it right and find the right methods and right data there.
Okay, great, thank you. And what research within negative emissions do you think could be valuable to carry out onwards?
Oh, there's a large need for a lot of different research. I'm very interested in identifying and finding the ways to develop those negative emissions that can have large co-benefits. And I've talked here a bit about environmental co-benefits, but it's also about social co-benefits. Biochar, for example, has the potential to have large impact on food security of people in tropical areas, which is where we find poor populations in the world, for example. So that kind of research, and also research going towards implementation, I find very important.
Okay, great. And the last question, Cecilia. What is your most important take-home message to the audience here today?
Yes. But we do need negative emissions, and that we want to develop negative emissions in good ways that can give us additional benefits for climate, for the environment, and for development in general.
Great. Thank you so much, Cecilia Sundberg, Associate Professor at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. Great. If you are interested to learn more about the field of negative emissions, you will find more information in these two selected publications. And the first one is Assessing the Diverse Environmental Effects of Biochar Systems, an Evaluation Framework. And the second one is a chapter, Carbon Dioxide Removal. And all these links are available at the calendar post for the event at lifecyclecenter.se. And please feel free to contact Cecilia for questions. And here you can see her email address. The Life Cycle Talks are published by the Innovation Cluster for the Life Cycle Perspective and the Swedish Life Cycle Center. And to ensure you don't miss next Life Cycle Talk, follow us on LinkedIn and subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you for listening.